crop thinning. And we show you that as much as we think that we know about crop thinning, we don't know a lot. Cluster thinning is something that was studied. Everybody does cluster thinning. Everybody has their own theories about cluster thinning. The first study on cluster thinning published is 1970 by Dr. Cleaver at UC Davis working on table grapes. So that's the first time the cluster thinning was studied. And after that, most of the study on cluster thinning really is based on the classical ratio between leaf area and yield. So let's look for the magic number. How many leaves do I need to ripe a perfect cluster for different varieties in different locations? So that's the research on Cleaver and Dukuslian on leaf-to-fruit ratio, vine balance. It's a big chapter. So we did some work on cluster thinning at Michigan State. There was one of my first students, Shijian Zhuang. He came to Michigan State, a very funny guy. He came to study with me for different reasons, I cannot tell you. But did a good job. His interest was understanding the effect of cluster thinning on Cabernet Franc, especially on methoxypyrazine. He published a couple of papers. And after Tommaso came as a postdoc, and now he's a professor at University of Piacenza. And we did some work, very interesting, especially in the Southwest, using these heavy cropping, heavy bearing varieties like Cabernet Franc. We did a bunch of different treatments during the years, crop thinning, together with leaf removal, without leaf removal, this and that. So classical approach, and here are some results from 2 years. That's I always like to show to the growers, especially when they're telling me, I will harvest the grapes. I'm waiting another week, And I said to them, nothing gonna happen if your hanging time is getting longer. And the reason is because here 2 years of data, 2011, 2012. If you remember, 2012 was very warm, 2011 was very cool. So you have the evolution of the accumulation as a rate of accumulation of color compounds, anthocyanins, in relation to different treatments, leaf removal, thinning plus leaf removal. 2 years, you see the effect of the year. In a warmer year, you get an accumulation that's very fast at the beginning. But just to tell you, it's not part of my talk, but just keep this in mind when you think about harvest time. The accumulation of the color compounds start few days after veraison, and it stops right there. Everything happened 2-3 weeks after veraison. After that, it's only degradation. So if you're hanging your grapes willing to have more color or more antioxidant, will not happen. After 3 or 4 weeks from veraison, everything that happened in the berries is a degradation of these compounds, acid, and accumulation of sugar. So everything happens very early. So, and you can see from here. The difference are pretty evident between the 2 years, but you see here in a cool vintage, if you do some crop thinning, you increase the rate of accumulation of color compounds. In a warmer year, you have more accumulation, but the treatment doesn't do anything. It's like a control, okay? So we published this, and we show different things like this one, for example. If you do cluster thinning in a very cool year, the fruit maturation, that's a distribution of bricks in relation to the treatment, gets to be very uniform. So if I do cluster thinning in a cool year, I get the fruit very uniform. They look more similar to each other. If I do the same treatment in warmer here, you see the distribution is very wide. Doesn't change anything. Okay? So the warm here doesn't change anything if I do cluster thinning or leaf removal. So with this in mind, we came to this conclusion, and I think now I'm thinking that those conclusions are wrong. But that's okay. I published the paper, so my chair is happy. What we see is that under a cool year, there is an effect of what we do in the vineyard. Not so much in a warm year, okay? And the thinning can do an acceleration of ripening under cool conditions, but not so much under warm conditions. And when you put together cluster thinning and leaf removal, then you get an extra advantage, but not in a cool year. So with this in mind, with this kind of behavior, we as a group ask ourselves, why? Is that true, what we see? What's the reason for this? Where is coming this difference? What are driven by what? Really by the temperature? Or driven by which kind of factor? Now with this in mind, we went in the literature. At the end of 2023, what is the most famous professor of viticulture in the world right now? Stefano Poni, that is the editor of the Australian Journal Grape Wine Research, is the editor of the American Journal of Viticulture and Enology, wrote a review and said, I think we don't know anything about cluster thinning. That's his conclusion. We don't know anything. This is the best professor of viticulture in the world. I hope he can come and be next year for the Dirt to Glass. Ishmael studied with Stefano Poni. There is a lot of study on this cluster thing. Someone says, oh, we saw this and it happened that, and another study we saw some other different, this and that. So I think it was the time for us, during COVID, to sit down, read all the publication that was published from 1950, from the first time a paper on cluster thinning was published, up to now. Do a meta-analysis, collect all the data, give the data to a computer and say, tell me what you see. What are the really important things that happen with cluster thinning? So in this paper we had two objectives. The first one was to understand timing. You can talk with every viticulture in this room and they will say that the best timing for cluster thinning is this. Someone will say, no, I think you should go later than that. And the second objective that we had was to understand intensity. How many clusters I need to remove to get an effect? Okay? With this in mind, we went through the 200 publications that was on the literature, published on peer-reviewed journals only. Okay? So we read only publication on peer-reviewed journals. Only the data we show, only data coming from Vitis vinifera, not hybrids, because hybrids they crop more, and so the range of yield being very similar in vinifera, it's very large when you put the hybrids. It was a skew, was making the data not very significant. No partial cluster thinning. A lot of people in the world, they do cluster thinning in a different way. They remove the tip of the clusters, they remove the shoulders. Not the kind of studies. Only manual thinning, no mechanical thinning studies. Vineyard, real scenario, not pots or greenhouses. So from the 160 publication that was published from the 70 to 2022, we come up with 78 peer-reviewed publications that we crunch through the computer. So here are some results. They're very interesting, at least for me. Where the study are coming from all over the world. That's the world. Lots of study in the US. That's Michigan. That's a Shenzhen. Study from California, Washington State, Oregon, in Italy. That's the Piemonte with Nebbiolo. Emilia Romagna with Lambrusco, several studies in the south with Aglianico. You have all Croatia, that's and Friuli. That's my friend Paolo Civilotti. That was the speaker last year at our conference. He has a record. He's the person that published the highest number of studies in cluster thinning in the world. So when I show him the data, I was very happy. So Spain and all the world. So you see a map of study done in a lot of different climates. Okay, most important region. This is the trend of publication. Not so many in the 70s, and the starts to skyrocketing, and now there are more people working on these topics and still publishing papers on cluster thinning. So let's go to the question. When we went through all the publication, we need to find a way to put the publication all together for the data analysis. For the cluster thinning, the timing of cluster thinning that each researcher choose are those. There are people that do cluster thinning at bloom. There are people that do cluster thinning at pea-size berries. There are people that do cluster thinning at lag phase. There are people doing cluster thinning averaging. So this is the fourth timing that was very common to all the papers that we went through. As far as intensity, there are studies that drop 25% of the fruit, study that drop 40% of the fruit, 45% of the fruit, a study that drops 65% of the fruit. So remember this, because all my data will go through this. Timing, 4 timings. Intensity, 3 different intensities, okay? So if we put all these thousands of data together, what we see as a result of all this study, the most important thing is that you do cluster thinning, you reduce yield. Yeah. And it's very highly statistically significant, okay? The most interesting thing, you see, changing pH is due to the increase in Brix. Cluster thinning in all the study, all the varieties, all the environment, increase the Brix, okay? The other thing that you see, a huge increase in leaf area to fruit ratio. So you have more leaf for that kind of yield. Those is the summary of all the thousands of data that we had, okay? And I will focus on Brix from now on. People are measuring color compounds, phenolics, and everything. But all these compounds tends to be very tied to sugar. And that's the reason why we show you only the sugar variation, because when you get a sugar variation, you take with you also the other fruit quality parameters. Now, that gets a little bit more complicated from a statistical point of view, but I will explain in the most simple way that I can. This is a PCA, principal component analysis. What this statistical method does, this statistical method put together the trends of all the variables in the direction that they go. If they go together, they are on the same line, same direction, the same quadrant. If they don't go together, they go another quadrant. If they are opposite to each other, they go to the opposite quadrant. So what you see here is that cluster thinning severity goes together with vine density, goes together with pH and sugar. Doesn't go together with vine age, for example. Oh, here it's more clear. Growing degree days, the warmer you are, the less precipitation you have. So this data tells you that the intensity, the severity, goes together with the fruit quality. You don't see the timing there. So if we do another PCA, they're more complicated, in which we want to see really the factors that are important. You see that the cultivar is very important for the effect of cluster thinning. The severity is very important for the results. The color of the berries is very important. The rootstock quite important. Everything else is not. Rain, temperature, vine age, everything else doesn't really count for the effect of the cluster thinning. When we get through the details of the experiments, those are all the varieties that were used in the study. The most studied varieties in the world for cluster thinning is Cabernet Sauvignon. The variation in Brix between the cluster thinning and the control is almost 0. And we're still doing cluster thinning Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon does not respond to cluster thinning. Like, for example, Semillon. Riesling respond a lot. If you cluster thin Riesling, you increase the Brix. If you cluster thin Cabernet Franc, you don't increase the Brix. The sensitivity of the variety to the cluster thin is very important, as the type of rootstock that you use. There are rootstock that doesn't make any difference. There are rootstock that are very sensitive. 103%, very sensitive. For us, fortunately, 10114, very sensitive. If you do a cluster thinning on a variety on 10114, we respond. Other 3309, we respond. Others, we not. So there is a sensitivity of cluster thinning driven by the variety, driven by the rootstock. But now is the big conclusion. They should start to sparkle some discussion. Now let's get all the data. Let's take a look at the Brix difference after cluster thinning in relation to the timing. So the 4 timings are discussed before, and the intensity. Okay? Let's take a look at the timing has a variability yield and leaf area to fruit ratio. We can focus on yield. So if I drop fruit at different timing, I reduce from 5 kilograms of fruit per vine to 3 kilograms. And those are the bricks, okay? You see that at each single timing, the lines are parallel, okay? What does it mean? Means that the effect in increasing bricks is independent of the timing. Every time I reduce the clusters, I do cluster thinning, the increase in bricks is the same. There is no effect on timing on sugar accumulation. This is what all the data from all over the world is telling me. Timing is not important. Let's take a look at the second one, intensity. 25, 45, 65. I drop the fruit, and you see here, this treatment go from 22 to 23. An increase in bricks, if I drop, how much? 45%. If I drop 25 or 65, the line are parallel. I reduce the yield, I don't increase the bricks. When I drop a little, when I drop too much. So coming back to my beginning, when the winemakers were telling me, we will never ripe this fruit. Drop 50% of the fruit, 60% of the fruit. Will not do anything to the ripening of the fruit. Dropping a little or dropping too much, you get the same effect. It's when you drop a range that's about 45% in relation to the control, that you get an increase in bricks. It's the medium level of crop thinning that does the work. Not the timing, but the medium level. Not too much, not too less. I know I have not a lot of time, so I'll go quick through the conclusion. So, the time of cluster thinning, from all the study, from all over the world, is telling me is not important. Now, you can find a study that will say dropping a bloom is better than dropping a veraison, but that will be the exception in the general trend. The trend of all the study is timing is not important. So that means for us, from a viticulture point of view, we have a little bit more flexibility. We can drop any time during the season. The second thing is the intensity. The intensity is very important. We can drop too much, we can drop a little. We need to drop around 40% of the fruit to have a good increase on sugar that will balance out the threshold between reducing yield, increasing bricks. So that's what the study is telling me. And that's what I think most of the people, without knowing this, do in the vineyards. So with this, I'm done. I don't think I have maybe I have a question. I have time for questions?
So we can take only one.
Only one. Pronto.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paolo. Much.